Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to the Japanese or Suzuka post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? I thought it was a fairly good race. We had some pit strategy that caused some position changes, and we had some on-track action that was really good to see. Going through those S's, we saw some extraordinary moves from some folks, and we saw some normal straightaway actions for that DRS passing. But what was your thoughts on this race? Did you enjoy it? Please leave a comment below. Now I will go through the drivers from last to first and give you my thoughts on how each driver did and possibly what happened to those drivers if they had to come out farther behind than we were expecting them to. So without further ado, we will start off with Alex Albon and Daniel Ricciardo. They both got shunted at turn 3 on the first lap of the race, where Daniel Ricciardo was trying to little edge out some room and end up causing a collision with Alex Albon. His right rear tire kind of came in contact with Alex Albon's front left tire, which then had a pretty big shunt for both of them, spinning Daniel Ricciardo and sliding him into the wall, where Alex Albon kind of went straight off into the gravel and into the tire barrier. And so that's going to cause some concern for the Williams, as they are already short on chassis. And so they're going to have to see if they can get that chassis fixed. And hopefully they do, because they don't have another spare chassis. And a lot of those updates that they were putting on those kind of were non-existent for any spares at this point, after Logan Sargent had that off earlier in the weekend. So this kind of leaves them in a kind of a lurch going into China in 2 weeks to try to see if they can get that car repaired and get that parts enabled so that they can bring both cars with all of the updates that they were expecting to try to gain ground and possibly get points in China. Now, Daniel, I don't think it was really Daniel's fault, but if you had to blame someone, it would be Daniel. He was kind of coming through. He was looking to his left to try to see where they were going to position himself, so he didn't really see Alex Albon coming up on his right, and kind of drifted over, not leaving Alex Albon a lot of room to where he could go, and that front tire kind of collided in that regard. So both of them out, unfortunately, in the first lap, which then kind of made a very early ending for them this weekend. So not a lot to say about them and how they were going. I know Daniel was trying to recover and show what he can do, so he was hoping that that would be a little bit better this weekend. But in overall, it's another weekend that he can basically hopefully put behind him, where he can come back in China and actually show what he was capable of in that RB and get at least competitive with Yuki, which Yuki had another good day this weekend, so that's kind of hard on him. Now you have Juan Yuzhou that came in 18th. It's actually an improvement, even though he had a DNF there. From what all I can tell, his gearbox kind of let go, and so he had to be retired early in on this race. So he was out on lap 12, and so he didn't make it very far in the stint either. I know he had a couple of pit stops trying to figure out if they could fix that, and it didn't really help, and so they just ended up retiring that stake kick F1 car. So he didn't have a very long day and had to park it, and so we don't have a whole lot else to say about Juan Yuzhou. And I know he was looking forward to next week, but he was hoping to have a decent running to lead up to that, to build up his confidence in that regard. And I know they were having trouble with those pit stops for that stake F1, which I didn't see this time around, so hopefully they got a grip on that pit stop issues that they were having. I know they were a little bit more careful, a little bit slower on their pit stop strategies. So if that's the cause of it, or if that's something else that they can get away with on that stake F1, hopefully they can have that under their belts and get those pit stops done fairly quickly from this point on. Now, Logan Sargent qualified in 19th and ended up in 17th. At one point, he was doing really well, and I thought he was doing a really good job fighting with those cars around him, getting some passes done. I have him passing Gasly on lap 11 for 13th, Ocon on lap 15 for 11th, Then he had a nice off stint where he made a mistake and went off in turn 9 that he pretty far into the race and kind of backed him up into the gravel where he took a while to get backed up, and he backed up onto the track and then headed off bringing a bunch of dirt onto the track. But that was just causing a quick yellow in that regard. So not a whole lot going on in that. I think he just made that mistake, which really hurt him seriously because it dropped him way back in the pack, and where he ended up pretty much in the last place again. But I think he was actually doing a much better job this weekend than you'd normally see. So then we come to Pierre Gasly, and Pierre Gasly didn't have a very good race at all. He did have a good start at the very beginning, gaining 3 spots, but that Alpine is still not where they want him, and they had that little contact between him and his teammate, which caused some not wing damage, but some aero damage on that floor, and it really just kind of hurt him. I think overall, he did pit after the red flag, I would say. He pitted on lap 16, switching from hards to mediums, and then on lap 32 from the mediums to hards, and tried to finish up the run, but that Alpine just didn't really have what it took. And as you can see, his teammate was just ahead of him, who qualified in 15th and ended up in 15th. So he was pretty much in the same boat. He pitted on lap 19 from hards to another set of hards, and then on lap 33 switched over to a medium set. He did gain 2 positions at the very start of the race, but then, as I said, they had some contact with each other on the restart after the red flag, and that's what I think what kind of didn't help them in that regard. It wasn't a very good run for Alpine. I think they're still trying to learn that vehicle and get into more working condition. At one point, they were up higher in the regards, trying to fight for those points, but then just kind of fell back into the pack, as we will see later. That's how the number of people that would just end up in that mid-pack passing them as the race went on. So they still have some work on the Alpine to get that where they really want it and get it to perform and maintain that performance overall in the Alpine. Valtteri Bottas was really looking good as well at the beginning. Qualified in 13th and ended up in 14th, which is actually a little bit farther back. But for him, and I think in that Stake F1, which they were arguably probably the worst car coming in for a lot of things, really having issues with those pit stops too, which we didn't see. I mean, we saw those careful, so it wasn't the greatest pit stop, but it was actually not the worst, as they've seen in the past, getting things messed up and having them have those extra long pit stops. So that's good to see. He actually pitted on lap 6 from softs to hards, and then 22 to another set of hards. I have him actually passing Ocon on lap 16 for 12th position, and again Ocon on lap 25 for that 14th position. So he was up there kind of in the running, close to that point range earlier on in the race, and then just ended up dropping back into the field. I think they're having a little bit of trouble as well, but I think that gives them hope in that sense that Stake F1 car is not quite as bad as they were thinking it was at the beginning. Maybe they're starting to get some grips on that performance and what they need to do to tweak that car and to get it to run correctly on any given weekend. Now we have come to Kevin Magnussen, who qualified in 18th. A pretty bad qualifying position for Kevin, but made it up to the 13th position. He did gain 2 positions on the initial start, and then he passed Gasly on lap 7 for 12th, and basically had a fairly good run for him, going to lap 22 before he switched from mediums to hards, and then he switched to another set of hards later. So a good 2-stop race for him, kind of hanging in there, really fighting it out with the people around him, but not really gaining the ground that he was looking for. Nico Hulkenberg, who qualified in 12th and ended up in 11th, had a decent first start with gaining 2 positions, but that second restart after that red flag, he had a horrible start, which dropped him back in the field, which meant that they probably decided to switch the strategy for him and switch from those soft tires to hard tires on lap 5. So that threw him back at the back of the field, and then he worked his way back up to 11th. So Nico Hulkenberg actually had a fairly good run for what they were looking at initially after that restart. Almost getting into the points, but not quite making it into that end. He did stop, as I said, on lap 5, and then he switched again on lap 33. He passed Bottas on lap 47 for 13th. He passed K-Mag on lap 49 for 12th. And he passed Stroll on lap 53, the very last lap, for that 11th spot. Not quite making it to Yuki. He had a pretty good gap to Yuki. Get that last point, but a really good running for Nico after that issue. And then qualifying in 12th was not bad either, kind of getting up in that run. So I think Nico Hulkenberg this year is having a fairly good year, and I think he's coming to terms how to get the most out of that Haas, where Kevin is having a little bit of struggle in that regard. He seems to be a little bit behind Hulkenberg this year. We'll have to see how that plays out for the rest of the season and see if they can bring some more updates. I know that apparently Haas is actually bringing an update for China, so we'll see if that actually is a good thing. I know in the past Haas has had issues bringing updates and getting things. They're trying to bring big updates, and they, like last year, and they didn't really work out. So they're bringing a lot more smaller ones. So hopefully they have an idea, and those can build up on each other and get them in the running and keep them in that running for those last few points on this strategy. So they're kind of falling behind that RB as Yuki gained another point this week. So if you made it this far and I like what you see, I'd appreciate a like. And if you want to see more of this, give me a subscribe. And now we'll reach the top 10 positions. And I said Yuki Tsunoda in that 10th position, qualified in 10th, and was the last car to be lapped. So they lapped all the way down to 10th position. So a fairly standard run, it seems to be this year, getting lapped all the way through half the field. But a really good run for Yuki Tsunoda. He did have a pretty bad start because he tried to start on mediums. Then they switched to softs in that red flag scenario. So then he went to a set of hards on lap 7 and did another set of hards on lap 22. He did pass Gasly on lap 13 for 14th position. He passed Hulkenberg on lap 34 for 10th. And basically was able to maintain that. And he had some really good passing in the S's, kind of going around the outside. If you saw those are kind of phenomenal, and you're not normally seeing passes there. So that was kind of good to see some odd passes here and there we saw from a few people this weekend. So we're kind of getting that closeness of the following the cars and being able to get around the outside with the difference in tires. So hopefully that'll continue throughout the rest of the season. So a really good running, and nice to see him gaining a point at his home race. And I think this is the first time he's ever gained a point at his home race. So that's good to see Yuki, keeping up the good work and showing how that RB can be competitive. Now we come to Lewis Hamilton, who had a horrible weekend, qualifying in 7th, dropping down to 9th. He was really struggling on that first set of tires, and I think they were trying to do a one-stop run. So he was actually started he started the race on mediums, switched to hards at the red flag, and then they were going to try to do that one-stop stint on the hards, and that didn't quite work out. He was having really tire trouble almost at the very beginning, and swapped positions with his teammate on lap 14 for that 7th position, and dropped him back down in that position. He was struggling and complaining about his tires going off, saying that the front tire was totally dead at that point. I know they were saying that the second and third stints were really good. Once they kind of switched strategies from that one stop to a normal two stop, like most people around them, that their lap times were competitive against them, but they seem to be dropping back a little bit for each pit stop that they've done, because he was up there potentially getting points at the very beginning, but kind of dropped back down. Sorry, as I said, he's probably fighting for that podium, and then really just dropped down in that field, and really wasn't able to really put pressure on those throughout the last part of the race. And at the very, very beginning, they were trying to go long, and that just caused some headaches for them because the tires were dead before they were really ready to pit and switch over to that two pit stop strategy. So I know he was looking good this weekend. He was feeling really well, but something didn't quite click on that first stint for the Mercedes, so they're going to have to try to investigate, try to figure out why it didn't match up to what they were planning, what data was suggesting that they run on that stint this weekend. So hopefully they can figure that out for China. And I know they're doing basically live testing this year because they switched strategies on that vehicle, switching to those side pods instead of that zero side pod that they've had in the past. So they're still playing catch up for the rest of the field, and it kind of shows in some of those cases where we have Oscar Piastri just ahead of him. He had a not great weekend either. He basically qualified in 6th and then dropped down to 8th. I don't have a whole lot going on. Didn't see a whole lot of on action or track action for Oscar Piastri. I know he was at one point fighting with Lewis, and it looked like his tires were pretty much gone at the end. Letting George by him near the end of the race. So keeping Lewis behind, but not quite where he needed to be, and to keep ahead of George Russell in that running. George Russell qualified in 9th and ended up in 7th, so basically the opposite of Lewis. Pretty close, but not quite on those the qualifying laps, and did a decent job in the track. As I said, they passed swap positions with Lewis on lap 14, making George Russell get into that 6th position, and then basically fighting those positions, and then eventually passing Oscar on lap 53 for that 7th position. Their pit strategy, he pitted just ahead of Lewis on lap 22 for another set of hards, and then lap 37 he went from a set of mediums after that set of hards, trying to gain. So he had a little bit more tire life in that tire instead of Oscar, who pitted on lap 32. So he had a couple laps that he had left in that tire over the McLaren, allowing him to get past Oscar for that 7th position. Fernando Alonso claimed he had one of his best races ever, in the sense that he was doing all the strategy that he could with that Aston Martin, which is probably not meant to be that far up in the field. He had a decent run. He did pit kind of early. He did start on a soft set of tires, trying to gain ground, and really wasn't able to gain as much ground as he was expecting on the softs, and then went on a medium set for quite a ways. Ended up boxing on 33 for a set of hards for the end. He did pass Lewis Hamilton on lap 22 for that 7th position. And then due to the pit stop strategies, he ended up getting ahead of them into that 6th position. And that kind of let his race, he was kind of pushing back Oscar into George to try to keep that battle going and prevent George from actually overtaking Oscar and then taking the fight to himself. So that was a good wily kind of maneuver for him, and he had a really good race that was kind of in that running, really pushing that Aston Martin, where I don't think the Aston Martin was very good in the straights. We heard his teammate Lance Stroll complaining about how bad that car was in the straights. As we've heard in the past, that car is kind of struggling for straight line speed. And so that was kind of hurting them in those long DRS zones. Then we come to Lando Norris, who you'd think had a pretty bad day after qualifying in third and ended up in fifth. He claimed it was not a horrible day. Yeah, I said it didn't look very good, but it was a decent running. He had a decent start for the start and restart as the top, I guess it's probably top 5 or 6 cars kind of stayed in that same line, not being able to really pass each other in those starting, positions. Those standing starts, are always tricky, but was able to kind of keep those positions and keep the people behind him, even if you didn't have the best of start on those runnings. He did pass Lewis Hamilton on lap 17 for fourth. He passed Russell on lap 18 for third. He passed Russell again on lap 28 for seventh. He just didn't quite have enough in that McLaren, as the Ferraris were pretty much ahead of them. And then, of course, Alonso kind of got between them and the Mercedes, which kind of split them up a little bit. I think they were better than the Mercedes overall, but not near as good as the Ferraris. And so him qualifying in third, which was really good, but not quite having the car behind him to do a full race in that position, dropping down. I know he said he was, like 10 seconds worse than he was last year from that first position or something to that effect. So I know he was kind of down on McLaren as a whole, but as a general running for this weekend, I think he said that they were pretty much where they were expected. So they're hoping that they could kind of pull back a little bit in the upcoming races, kind of get the better feel matching for that McLaren. Charles Leclerc was driver of the day and qualified in 8th and made it all the way up to 4th. He had a really good run, basically did a one-stop. He stopped on lap 26th, switched from a medium set of tires to a hard, so he went a long ways on that medium set. Was really good, put him up in there, and it made some people change their minds on how that tire was going to run and how the hard tires were going to match up with those. So I think he really did a good job in that running, thinking that, after he switched that he was going to have to stop again and get another set of hards. And when he was kind of kept out there, the people were starting to question that and were able to make it where he was end up into that front running position. I know at one point he was, leading the race because he didn't stop. And then he was in that last podium position for a while before his teammate caught up with him with a new set of tires and was able to pass him in that running after being warned not to fight too much in the sense of wearing the tires out more than they were already at. I think they were worried that he would drop back in the clutches of Lando Norris or, in that sense, didn't want to wear the tires out more than they really needed to be and then cause some issues with, the positions potentially dropping farther back than they were thinking. So they basically had a pretty good clean run between the two teammates. They didn't have a big fight, but were able to run that regardless and had a good run coming back from that 8th position almost to the podium position. And if I wasn't going to choose him for the driver of the day, it's hard to say. I mean, it's nice to see Carlos having a decent run, as they probably weren't the best car for this track. Still coming into that the third position to the podium position, and being able ahead of the McLarens and the Mercedes, and as they were looking. Or, you could always argue with Max Verstappen getting the fastest lap and leading the race for the most of the stint, having a good run, steady run for him, and Sergio Perez not being that far behind him, so you could argue with those two. So there's quite a few people that you think of for driver of the day. Yuki at his home race, you could be a driver of the day as well. So what was your driver of the day? If it wasn't going to be Charles Leclerc, who would you choose? You can leave those in the comments and see if they would match up with other people or if you're standing alone in that regard. So Sergio Perez, how well did he do? He had a good start. He almost, the restart, a decent start, good restart, almost, kind of put pressure on his teammate Max for that restart, but was kind of kept in that second position and then just kind of stayed in that position. And throughout this raining, he had to do quite a bit of passing due to pit stop strategies and the like. So he did pit on lap 15, switching from mediums to mediums, and a lap 33 from those mediums to a set of hards. I have him passing Hamilton on lap 17 for fifth. He passed Russell on lap 19 for fourth. He passed Norris on lap 23 for third. Passed Charles Leclerc on lap 26 for second. And he passed Leclerc again on lap 36 for that third position, and then worked his way up to that second position due to some pit stop strategy, dropping out of the contention. So on-track action for him was fairly good that we saw on the broadcast, doing a good job, keeping up there, getting a good second, doing what he needs to do, really having that solid position for them to keep him at Red Bull. So it's hard to say that he needs to go if he's always coming in second for the most part. So I know they had a little bit of off last week, but so far he's looking pretty strong, looking fairly competitive. Not quite the big gaps that we saw in the past between him and his teammate, even though it's still a decent gap. It's not as quite as that large like we saw in the past seasons. So a good run for Sergio Perez, gaining 18 points for Red Bull. It's always good to see. And we have Max, who started off in first and ended up in first. Had a good start, a decent restart, keeping that lead. He did lose the lead when he did pit on lap 16, switching from mediums to another set of mediums, getting behind Charles Leclerc, who did not pit, and then having to pass him on lap 21 for that first position. So Charles Leclerc was able to keep that lead for like 5 laps. That Max Verstappen had to actually come back and lower the gap and then be able to get enough to get around him. And so that's kind of good to see, even though you see Max pretty much dominating. It's always good to see that he's not dominating like he was last year, where he had so much of a gap that he could just pit and stay out in first, and so you never really saw any kind of fight for the lead, even though it was a fake fight for the lead in the sense, because he was going to end up being into that first position because he had the fresher tires and at that point. But it was kind of neat to see some of that action, so that you could have some potential strategy of trying to back him up a little bit more than he normally would be, maybe causing him some issues that would potentially have some fights for that first position. So there's hope, at least in my view. There's still hope for some really good action in that first and second positions with that Red Bull and Ferrari, and potentially some Mercedes and McLarens in there as well. So I think that's really good to see. But just to give you a clear running for how good Max is, even in this race, on lap 10, he was 2.8 seconds ahead of his teammate. Lap 30, he was 10.7 seconds, and then at the end, he was 12.6 seconds ahead. He did gain the fastest lap, like 3 laps from the end, I believe. So he still had some decent running on those tires near the end, enough to get the fastest lap and get that extra point, as he always likes to do. But a really good run for him. But it gives us hope in the sense that there's that little bit of gap that potentially someone else could, put some pressure and potentially cause him to have a mistake or something to that effect that would, close that gap up a little bit more. So that kind of gives us the running for the Japanese GP race. We have the drivers' standings, and we basically have 11 through 21 staying the same, except for the fact that Yuki gained a point, so he gained a clear advantage over Oliver Behrman for that 11th position, but staying in that same position, even though gaining that point. So, but the top 10, we saw a few changes. We saw Lance Stroll dropping back to 10th behind Lewis after Lewis gained 2 points, bumping him up to 9th place. And we see Fernando Alonso and George Russell being tied, but staying in those positions. So we'll have to see how that next race goes to see who's going to edge out the other for that 7th position, and potentially more, but most likely for that 7th position. And then we see the two McLarens switching positions. So Oscar dropping behind Lando Norris for 6th, and Lando Norris jumping up to 5th with 37 points. And Carlos Sainz gaining ground but staying in that 4th position. Charles Leclerc dropping from 2nd to 3rd with 59. Sergio Perez getting that 2nd position with 64. And then, of course, Max Verstappen gaining that little bit extra lead with 77 points. So that's kind of the current standing for the drivers. And for the constructors, we see the same order that we saw last week with Alpine at the very end, and Stake, Kick, Sauber right in front of them in 9th, William in 8th, Haas in 7th. And of course, we have RB in 6th, gaining a point. So they have now 7 points, but still pretty far behind that 5th position, but gaining the ground on the Haas's there. Aston Martin gaining a little bit of points into that 33 points with Alonso gaining points, but Stroll dropping out of the points. Mercedes jumping up to 34 points. McLaren to 69. Ferrari gaining 100, getting up to 120, but now a bigger gap between them and Red Bull, who have 141 points at this point, where there was only 4 points. It's a difference last week. So without Max doing a DNF, we have Red Bull doing that 1-2, which gives them the nice point spread. So what else is coming up? We have the China or Shanghai GP coming up in 2 weeks. And with this, we basically have a length of 3.387 miles with a total laps of 56 going to be run for a total race distance of 189.559 miles. The lap record was 1 minute, 32.238 seconds, held by Michael Schumacher in 2004. And it was first introduced in 2004. So this is a sprint weekend. So be forewarned that you're going to have sprint qualifying and the sprint race, coming up on Saturdays with the race on Sunday. And with the time change, the time difference between China and wherever you're watching this could be kind of an odd schedule that coming up. So be forewarned that you probably need to look at your schedule to figure out when you want to watch the race if you're watching it live. So until then, farewell and see you on the grid.